So, the longest full government shutdown in U.S. history is here. And it really forces a crucial question. Is Washington finally actually serious about ending runaway federal spending?
That really is the central question, isn't it? And well, for the first time in a while, it seems like the answer might be yes, at least from one perspective. Our sources definitely paint a picture where, the push for fiscal discipline isn't just talk anymore, it's actively stalling the government.
Exactly. And that's our mission today. We want to cut through some of the noise and really unpack the mechanics of this 2025 shutdown. We're focusing on the core disagreements between the parties, the fight for actual budget restraint, and of course the pretty dramatic consequences this standoff is having in the real world.
Yeah, and it helps to get grounded in the timeline first. As of today, November 3rd, we are 34 days into this thing. That makes it the longest full government shutdown the U.S. has ever experienced. It all started back on October 1st, 2025, simply because Congress couldn't pass the appropriation bills needed for the 2026 fiscal year.
Right, so this isn't just like an accident or a failure to get things done on time. It feels much more like a deliberate standoff. At its heart, you've got the Republican push for, well, budget restraint, getting the national debt under control, versus Democrat demands for some major spending extensions, often for programs about to expire. It really feels like a financial reckoning in Washington.
Let's dig into that core conflict, because the Republican motivation here is really key. They seem to view this shutdown less as a failure and more as an maybe necessary confrontation, to finally restore some fiscal discipline. The argument is that the national debt has just hit an absolutely critical and unsustainable point.
And it's hard to just ignore the numbers they're pointing to, right?
Yeah.
You look at the U.S. national debt clock, it gets mentioned a lot in the sources, or those, frankly, quite disturbing long-term projections from the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO. You can see why there's this sense of urgency to slow down the spending growth. It feels like it's becoming less about policy and more about basic math.
That's right. And you hear that reflected in statements like Senator John Thune's defense of this approach. He said, budget restraint isn't cruelty, it's responsibility. That really sums up the conservative thinking here. Making some painful cuts now is seen as, well, a duty to the country's financial future.
And they tie that directly to the economic worries people are feeling right now, like at the grocery store. Republicans are definitely connecting this level of federal spending to the high prices we've been seeing. The argument is pretty straightforward. Massive government spending fuels inflation. They kept pointing to the consumer price index data as, evidence that cutting spending is actually necessary to cool things down. It's a practical argument for why they're holding the line of the shutdown.
But, the path to just getting a basic continuing resolution, that's the stopgap measure, just to keep the government running it, hit a wall almost immediately. And it was purely because of Democratic demands that went way beyond just keeping current services funded.
Okay, so what specifically blocked the GOP's CR? Because we're talking about a temporary funding measure here, not the full-year budget.
Well, the main sticking point initially was the Democrats trying to force an extension of those Enhanced Affordable Care Act, or ACA subsidies. They were set to expire at the end of the year, and Democrats basically said no CR passes unless it includes keeping these subsidies going. They were using the funding deadline as leverage for a major policy win.
Okay, but then it escalated beyond that, right? It wasn't just the ACA subsidies. I read they came back with a stiff counteroffer involving, what, increasing health spending by $1 trillion? Is that right?
Right.
A trillion.
Yeah, staggering number.
Yeah.
$1 trillion increase in health spending.
Wow. Was that like a serious starting point for negotiation, or was it more of a message, something designed to be rejected?
The sources suggest it was seen as the latter. Republicans dismissed it almost immediately as unserious. But that $1 trillion figure really highlights the enormous gap we're talking about. This isn't a fight over a few billion here or there. It's a fundamental disagreement about whether the federal government should be shrinking or, expanding massively.
And before we move off the core conflict, we absolutely have to mention a key part of the Republican proposal: security. Increased funding for border enforcement, immigration control that's explicitly named as a must-have, citing the official CBP border encounter statistics as proof that a new strategy is needed. For the GOP, that focus on the border and national security is tied right into the idea of fiscal responsibility.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit from the why the policy fight to the how, the actual mechanics of the deadlock, because the shutdown wasn't really caused by the House not acting. It came down to a procedural issue in the Senate: the filibuster.
Right, let's just quickly clarify what this continuing resolution, the CR, actually is. It keeps coming up.
Sure. So a CR is basically like a temporary patch. It lets the government keep operating, usually at the current spending levels, maybe with small adjustments, just until they can agree on a full, proper budget. The House, led by Speaker Mike Johnson, actually passed what they called a clean CR. It funded the government, but at reduced levels and without those extra Democratic policy demands. But that bill went nowhere in the Senate.
And that's where the filibuster rule kicks in, correct? You need more than just a simple majority to pass spending bills there.
Exactly. Even if Republicans had 51 votes, it wasn't enough. The CR repeatedly failed because it couldn't get the 60 votes needed to break a filibuster. Our sources show Senate Democrats blocked that Republican CR, get this, 13 separate times. So in this case, the Senate minority using that procedural tool to block basic government funding is, technically speaking, what caused the shutdown to drag on.
And that gridlock provoked a pretty big public reaction from the White House, didn't it? President Trump went on Truth Social, calling for Senate Republicans to just end the filibuster rule altogether. He clearly saw the rule itself as the main obstacle, stopping his agenda and prolonging the whole crisis.
Yeah, the whole situation really showed how fragile the funding process is. But what's also interesting is that the Democratic front wasn't totally united. We saw something pretty rare. 3 Democrats, Senators Fetterman, Cortez Masto, and King, actually broke ranks and voted for the Republican plan.
Really? 3 crossed over.
Yes. It signaled that, for some at least, just ending the shutdown and getting the government open again felt more urgent than continuing the fight over those specific policy writers.
So while the Senate was kind of tied up in knots with procedure, the administration seemed to be using the shutdown itself quite actively. Not just as leverage, but maybe as a tool to push for some deeper structural changes in government.
Yeah.
President Trump even called the shutdown an unprecedented opportunity to cut into agencies he saw as wasteful, or, in his words, a political scam.
Right, and this is where this shutdown really starts to look different from past ones. Normally, during a shutdown, agencies put employees on furlough, that's temporary, unpaid leave, but you expect to come back. This time, the administration went for something much more permanent: mass layoffs. The official term is reductions in force, or RIFs. The stated goal was to actually shrink the size of the federal workforce permanently.
So not just go home for a bit, but actual pink slips, permanent job losses.
Precisely. A furlough means you wait it out, and RAF means the job is gone, and it happened pretty quickly. By October 10th, the reports say at least 4,100 federal workers got those permanent layoff notices. It looked like a very targeted effort to, streamline things and make government leaner.
Were certain departments hit harder than others by these RAFs?
Yes, the cuts appeared strategic. The Department of the Treasury saw the biggest number, about 1,446 workers let go. Then the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, lost around 1,100, and many of those were reportedly concentrated at the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
And there was pushback, right? Legal challenges.
Oh, absolutely. Labor unions sued almost immediately. They managed to get a temporary restraining order to stop more RIFs, arguing that the whole action was illegal under something called the Anti-Deficiency Act.
Okay, wait, that act keeps coming up, the Anti-Deficiency Act. For listeners who maybe don't follow budget law closely, what does that law actually do that makes these RIFs potentially illegal during a shutdown?
Good question. Basically, the Anti-Deficiency Act stops federal agencies and employees from spending money, or even promising to spend money later incurring obligations if Congress hasn't actually appropriated the funds first. It's the law that actually forces the government to shut down when funding lapses. The unions argued that initiating RIFs, which involves costs like severance pay and triggers unemployment benefits, was essentially creating new financial obligations without appropriated funds. So they argued the layoff itself was an illegal act during the funding gap. The court agreed enough to put a temporary halt to it, pausing that part of the administration's reform effort.
And beyond the layoffs, the administration also used another controversial tool more aggressively: rescissions. That's canceling funds Congress already approved.
Exactly. Withholding or canceling funds already on the books. They had already done some of this earlier in 2025, clawing back about US $9 billion meant for foreign aid and public broadcasting.
And then during the shutdown, they targeted other things.
Yes, it became very targeted. Billions more in approved funding got halted. High-profile transportation projects were specifically mentioned. Around $20 billion for transit in places like New York City and Chicago got frozen. The administration's justification was the need to review what they called unconstitutional contracting practices associated with those funds. It definitely sent a signal about withholding funds from certain areas, but eventually all this political maneuvering and these bureaucratic cuts collided head-on with the well-being of ordinary people. Which brings us to the really dramatic SNAP showdown.
Yeah, this seems like the most direct painful consequence for a huge number of Americans. We're talking about the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP. Over 42 million people rely on it, and almost 40% of those recipients are kids. And the program was basically set to stop issuing any benefits for November 2025. Just stop.
Right. And the USDA's position here was really controversial. They argued that the $9 billion needed to pay out the monthly SNAP benefits simply wasn't legally available from the program's emergency contingency reserves. They pointed again to the Anti-Deficiency Act as the reason why they couldn't touch that money. This was apparently a reversal of how they'd handled contingency funds in past shutdowns, suggesting their hands were legally tied.
That stance, unsurprisingly, led to immediate lawsuits, and the court stepped in pretty fast, didn't they?
Very quickly. Two different federal judges ruled that the USDA stopping the payments was unlawful. They explicitly ordered the administration to tap into that SNAP contingency fund, which held somewhere between $4.6 and $5 billion immediately. So you had the judicial branch directly overruling the administration's interpretation of budget law in this specific critical case.
Okay, so the courts forced their hand. Did the administration comply?
They did. The Trump administration agreed to follow the court order and, quote, deplete SNAP contingency funds completely. But, well, you can do the math. $5 billion isn't the $9 billion needed for a full month. So what people got were reduced SNAP benefits for November, only covering about half, 50% of what households would normally receive.
Wow, only half. And even getting that partial payment out has been a problem, right?
A huge problem. The court documents themselves acknowledged it. Getting even that partial amount distributed is facing significant delays, potentially weeks, even months in some states. It turns out reprogramming all the state-level computer systems to issue these unusual reduced payments is apparently a massive logistical nightmare. So the attempt to manage funds led to this chaotic, delayed half measure of relief. So if we pull back and synthesize what our sources are telling us, from the conservative viewpoint driving this, the shutdown wasn't just some unfortunate breakdown and compromise. It was seen as a direct, maybe even unavoidable, consequence of years of congressional overspending. And that problem was made worse, in their view, by the Senate minority using procedural tools like the filibuster to block spending controls and push for even more massive unchecked spending.
Yeah, it seems this fight really forced Washington, or at least part of it, to confront the national debt issue directly. And it led to these initial, quite painful steps towards what they'd call government reform and efficiency, like the RAF's meant to be permanent cuts, and dusting off those targeted rescissions. It really showed a deep ideological commitment to fiscal restraint, almost regardless of the immediate political fallout.
But the situation on the ground is still incredibly messy, isn't it? You have the courts forcing the release of some funds, like with SNAP. You still have Democrats reportedly demanding that huge $1 trillion increase in health spending. It really makes you wonder, how long can Congress keep having these kinds of high-stakes political battles, risking these really painful, chaotic outcomes for everyday people before they're forced to fundamentally change the whole spending process itself? Because the way it works now seems almost designed to create crisis after crisis.